The dog kept pushing his face into the crying toddler's mouth. Not toward him, into him. Nose pressed hard against the boy's lips, inhaling in long, deliberate pulls while the child screamed and pushed at the dog's enormous head with both fists. His parents thought he had finally snapped. They were wrong about everything. Callum had been sick the week before. A stomach virus that arrived on a Wednesday leveled him by Thursday and was gone by Sunday, or so they thought. By Monday morning, he was back on his feet, pulling his red toy car across the living room carpet with that particular 2-year-old intensity that makes parents exhale for the first time in days. Nora, his mother, had made coffee. Her husband, Declan, was already in the garage getting ready for work. The house smelled like laundry detergent and the faint ghost of a toddler's fever that was finally behind them. Korvac was 7, a German shepherd with a broad, square head and the kind of stillness that made visitors nervous even though in 4 years of sharing a home with Callum, he had never once done anything that required a second thought. He slept at the foot of the boy's door. He let the boy use his flank as a pillow. When Callum had learned to walk and fell into him a dozen times a day, Korvac had simply absorbed each collision and stayed exactly where he was, like a piece of furniture that breathed. That Monday morning, something changed. Nora heard it before she saw it. Not a growl, not a bark, a sound she would later struggle to describe, somewhere between a whine and a push of air, repeated twice, from the living room. She came around the corner holding her coffee and stopped. Korvac had his face pressed directly against Callum's mouth. Not beside it, not near it. Against it. The dog's nose was making contact with the boy's lips, and Korvac was inhaling, slowly, deliberately. His eyes were not on the room. They were not on the door. They were focused somewhere past Callum's face, narrowed in the way dogs narrow their eyes when they are reading something with their whole body. Callum was crying. Both small fists were pushing at the dog's broad head, and the head was not moving. Nora said his name sharply. Korvac lifted his eyes to her, then dropped them back to Callum's face and pressed in again. She crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled Korvac back by the collar. He resisted. Not aggressively. There was no snarl, no tension in his body, but he planted his weight and leaned against her grip with a pressure she had never felt from him before. She managed to move him 6 inches. He moved forward again the moment she loosened her hold. Declan came in through the garage door and found his wife trying to hold a 90-pound dog away from his crying toddler with one hand and a mug of coffee with the other. What he saw looked like one thing. It was not that thing, but he didn't know that yet. Neither of them did. Declan got between Korvac and Callum. He got his arms around the dog and walked him backward toward the kitchen. Korvac dug in. All 4 paws dragged lines across the carpet, and even after Declan had him in the kitchen and put the door to, the dog sat directly against it, pressing his nose along the gap at the floor. Nora picked Callum up. He was still crying, the hard, inconsolable cry that had no object. She checked him over the way parents do, fast and thorough, running her hands along his arms, checking his face. Nothing. No marks, no red skin. She turned him toward the window and looked at his eyes. She was a registered nurse. 7 years of pediatric floor work before Callum arrived, and she stepped back to part-time. She had assessed thousands of children. She knew what distress looked like, what discomfort looked like, what fear looked like. She checked his pupils. She checked his color. She pressed 2 fingers against the glands along his jaw. Everything looked fine, and that, right there, was exactly the problem. Because everything looking fine was the conclusion her training pointed toward, and her training was working from the wrong set of facts. She set Callum down. He wobbled slightly on his feet and went back toward his red car, dragging it in a slow circle near the center of the room. His crying had softened to something quieter. He was pale, but children always looked pale after a week of illness. He was slower than usual, but he'd been sick. He moved like a boy whose tank was running low, and she read that as recovery, as normal, as expected. She did not read it as what it actually was. From the kitchen, Korvac had not moved. She could hear him against the door, not barking, not scratching, just pressing the sustained, deliberate pressure of a dog who was not going to give up. Declan looked at her over the top of Callum's head. Neither of them said it out loud, but the sentence was there between them the way sentences get when you've been together long enough. He'd never done anything like this before. Not once in 4 years. She thought about the conversations she'd had with the pediatric unit vet liaison during her years on the floor. The ones about dogs who turned when a new baby arrived. About how the behavior change was almost always slow. Almost always environmental. Almost always something you could trace back if you looked. She thought about the case from her 3rd year. The lab mix who had started guarding the infant in a way that looked like protection right up until it didn't. She pulled Declan into the hallway. "I think he needs to go to your mother's for a few days," she said, "until we figure out what this is." Declan nodded slowly. He didn't want to, but he nodded, because she was the one with the training, and the training said what the training said. The door to the garage opened and closed 20 minutes later. Korvac was in the back seat, looking through the rear window with an expression that had no word for it in any language humans have built for dogs. The house went quiet. Callum sat in the middle of the living room carpet with his red car. He had stopped crying. He was very still. Nora made another coffee and stood at the kitchen doorway, watching him. He was playing. That's what she told herself. Slow, quiet play. He was tired. He was recovering. Everything was fine. He put the car down. He looked at her. And then he lay down on the carpet. Not because he was tired, not because he was being playful. He lay down the way children lie down when their body has made a decision their mind hasn't caught up with yet. Sideways, one cheek against the carpet, arms loose. She was across the room before she had finished a thought. She put her hand on his forehead. Cool. She turned his face toward her. His color was wrong. Not pale from a virus wrong. Wrong in a different register. His lips were slightly dry. His breathing was shallow but present. She said his name. He responded but slowly, and the response had a quality to it, blurred at the edges that made every alarm she had go off simultaneously. She got her phone. She called 999, and while she was talking, kneeling on the floor next to her 2-year-old son, she thought about the dog. She thought about the nose pressed against Callum's mouth. She thought about the inhaling, the long, deliberate, focused inhaling, and something rearranged itself in the back of her mind, so fast she almost said it out loud on the call. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. They had glucose gel in their kit. They had Callum's blood glucose reading 4 minutes after that. The number was 2.1. The paramedic who read the monitor, a woman named Shearshay, 12 years on the job, looked at the number, looked at Callum, and then looked at Nora. How long has he been like this? "I'm not sure," Nora said. "An hour, maybe longer. I thought he was just recovering from the virus." Shearshay nodded once. She had the gel already moving. "The stomach virus likely wiped out his glycogen stores," she said. "He's been running on empty since the illness cleared. The body compensates, then stops compensating." She was watching the monitor. "We've got him. He's going to be fine." She paused and then she said something else. Quiet. Aimed at the middle distance more than at Nora. Another 40 minutes with that number and this call would have looked very different. Nora was on the floor. She didn't remember sitting down. She thought about Korvac pressed against the kitchen door, the sound he had made, the one she'd never heard in 4 years, the nose against Callum's mouth, the inhaling. Dogs can detect acetone, the ketone compound that builds in the breath when blood glucose drops into a dangerous range. They can detect it at concentrations so small that no instrument in a residential home would ever register it. Parts per trillion drawn up through olfactory architecture, 300 times more complex than anything humans carry. Korvac had been reading that breath from across the room. That's why he had come. That's why he would not stop and would not be moved and sat against the door after they took him away and pressed his face along the gap at the floor. He was not threatening Callum. He was reading his oxygen debt with the only instrument precise enough to catch it. He had been trying to get them to look. They were the ones who stopped him. The call to Declan's mother was short. Declan pulled up to the house 18 minutes later with Korvac in the back seat. The dog came through the front door and went directly to Callum, who was on the sofa now, color returning, glucose gel working, a paramedic beside him with the monitor running. Korvac put his nose against the boy's mouth. One long breath. Then he lay down on the floor beside the sofa and stayed. Nora sat in the hallway afterward and put her face in her hands, not because she didn't know enough, because she knew exactly enough to be wrong in the most thorough, professional, well-reasoned way possible. Every conclusion she'd reached had come from real knowledge. Every decision had felt responsible. She had used everything she had learned, and she had used it to take away the one thing that was actually working. If you stay for stories about what animals understand before we do, you're exactly where you should be. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. She thought about the lab mix from her third year, the one she'd flagged as a risk, the one that had turned out, when they reviewed the footage properly, to have been sleeping across the baby every night because the baby's room ran cold, and the dog knew it. She had been wrong then too. The thing about expertise is that it points you toward the most probable answer. Most of the time, the most probable answer is right. The math works. The training holds, but there is a category of event, narrow, rare, almost invisible, where the most probable answer is built from a sample that doesn't include the case in front of you, where the knowledge is real and complete and still wrong. Not because you failed, because you were working from everything you'd ever seen, and you had never seen this. Korvac had seen it the moment Callum walked into the room. Has your dog ever done something that made no sense until it was the only thing that made sense? Tell us in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard. Declan picked Callum up from the sofa an hour later, all color restored, glucose stable, a half-eaten banana in one fist. The boy leaned over his father's shoulder and looked down at the dog. Korvac looked up. If you subscribe to stories like this, animals who understood something we didn't, in time that mattered, you're in the right place. Every guardian deserves to be recognized, even the ones who never asked for anything in return. 4 months later, Callum was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, a formal diagnosis with a formal management plan, continuous glucose monitor on his arm, insulin protocol in place, pediatric endocrinologist on speed dial. A structured life built around numbers that had once been invisible. The monitor on his arm was accurate to within 0.2 millimole per liter. Korvac could detect a blood sugar event from 2 rooms away before the monitor alarmed. The pediatric endocrinologist, Dr. Fenella Ray, 12 years of practice, specialist in childhood metabolic disorders, sat with Nora at the follow-up appointment and asked whether the dog had shown any unusual behavior in the period before diagnosis. Nora described the morning, the noise, the nose against Callum's mouth, the way Korvac had leaned into her grip and would not stop and pressed himself against the door after they took him away. Dr. Ray listened without interruption. When Nora finished, the doctor was quiet for a moment. Dogs reliably detect ketone breath at concentrations the clinical literature estimates around 500 parts per trillion, she said. Your monitor would not have triggered at that level. Your son's behavior would have appeared within normal recovery parameters. She paused. The dog was not being aggressive. The dog was performing an assessment with better instruments than any of us have access to. She looked down at her notes, then back up. I've heard versions of this story 3 times in 12 years, she said. The dog always loses in the short term. The family always removes it, and the diagnosis always comes shortly after. She said it without judgment. Just the way a doctor states a pattern they have observed. Every time the dog was right, and everyone around it was confident and reasonable and wrong. Nora drove home and sat in the driveway for a while without getting out. The next morning, she found them the way she always found them eventually. The red toy car in the middle of the carpet, Callum asleep on his back on the sofa, one hand dangling over the edge. And Korvac on the floor beside him, his chin resting on the edge of the cushion, his nose 4 inches from the sleeping boy's face, watching, reading the air with everything he had, the way he had always done long before anyone knew there was something to read. If you've made it to the end of the story, the next one you need to see is closer than you think. We don't tell stories like this because they're dramatic. We tell them because they're true, and because the animal in them is always the last one anyone thought to believe.